So, I take it the construction on the bot is going well? Good. Tell me more. What do you mean you don't have the parts in yet? Okay, hold on. I've got someone here.
Well, hello again. In our last episode, we discussed mind control in the natural world, and that got me thinking. In fact, I liked it so much I decided to keep with the theme. Mushrooms taking ants for a joyride is unsettling, but hardly a problem for you human folk. But what if I told you that as recently as the 1960s, your brain may have been forcibly melted to a fine goo just because you mentioned anxiety to your doctor? Do I have your attention? Good. Then let's dive into the history of the CIA's problem child, a little project called MKUltra. MKUltra is the code name given to a series of experiments conducted on human subjects in the 1950s by the CIA. Are you really surprised? This was done to discover the secret of mind control. The crux of their plan? LSD. You heard me right. LSD, literal boatloads of it. LSD was discovered accidentally by chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938 at the Sandoz Chemical Company in Switzerland. That's right, the homeland of the world's most delicious chocolate is also the birthplace of one of the world's most infamous psychedelics. Hofmann was experimenting with the ergot enzyme and became dizzy when the mystery chemical made contact with his skin. After further testing, he realized he had created something entirely new and gave the compound its current title, lysergic acid diethylmide, LSD. He believed this new drug had the potential to treat all manner of mental illness, but his colleagues weren't so sure. In fact, the new substance's hallucinogenic properties made them so uncomfortable that they proved reluctant to hold on to any of it. Hofmann went on to start calling LSD his problem child. When the CIA's chief chemist, Sidney Gottlieb, caught wind of the miracle substance in 1949, he sent 2 CIA spies to purchase the entire stock of LSD at Sandoz, a whopping 10 kilograms of the drug. Of course, the staff at Sandoz were eager to get rid of the stuff. That was enough to dose half of the population of the United States at the time. Gottlieb was a senior member of the CIA, yet still a very peaceful and spiritual man. He lived in an eco-house with no running water, meditated by candlelight, and even milked his own goats every morning to make yogurt. He was also a master toxicologist and invented many poisonous, toxic, and just downright nasty substances with the intent to end lives. In fact, after his time with MKUltra, his new assignment was to take out Fidel Castro, Cuba's revolutionary prime minister. Good old President Eisenhower wanted him dead, so much so that he sent for Gottlieb personally. The chemist came up with some nasty tricks to off Castro, including cigars poisoned with the world's thinnest needles, an umbrella that discreetly shot tiny poison-tipped darts to kill in minutes, and my personal favorite, a wetsuit lined with hypertoxic fungus, since Castro loved to go diving in his free time. All brilliant failures, such is the way of science. Back to 1953. Mr. Gottlieb was given a daunting task after the initial discovery of LSD, courtesy of the US government. He was quite simply to discover the secrets of mind control. The government was certain it would be a vital weapon in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and had such bold plans as truth serums, brain-wiping drugs, or even sleeper agents to be activated, sent on horrible missions and made to forget it all afterwards. Yes, like the Winter Soldier. Shut up, let me finish. To achieve this, Gottlieb needed to first corner the global LSD market, so that the Soviets could not reverse engineer his hard work. He also needed to do it quickly, as he had begun to sample the product. In fact, Gottlieb dosed himself with LSD over 200 times during the project, according to his own account. Anyway, luckily enough for him, he was able to commission the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly to reproduce the compound, and he started making it in truly astounding quantities. Gottlieb then began his research, calling on the data of previous similar tests. Now, I hear you thinking, Dr. Bane, who could have possibly done mind control experiments with heavy drugs before the 1950s? The answer may or may not surprise you. In 1945, World War II came to an explosive end. The remaining Axis soldiers and scientists were rounded up by the US military and brought to testify on their crimes against humanity from then to 1949. These events were known as the Nuremberg Trials. Now, our boy Sidney Gottlieb, as it turns out, was very interested in the experiments the German scientists were cooking up. He even gave a few of their number diplomatic immunity so that he could share their research on mind control, sarin toxins, and mescaline toxins. And then he had some of those scientists start working for him. Remember, everyone, it pays to be smart. With the equipment and resources to begin the project, Gottlieb brought in agents from various departments of the CIA and began experiments in the United States, Canada, and even overseas. Setting up experiments overseas was perhaps the easiest part of the operation, as there is virtually no disposal problem. See, the test subjects were usually prisoners of war, refugees, and all others that the CIA determined no one would miss. So they had free reign, more or less. These overseas experiments were truly ghastly. In fact, too ghastly for YouTube. The infinite number of game overs from this crop has not yet been measured. MKUltra experiments in America were a bit more tame, but only by a very thin margin. Gottlieb's agents had to be more careful, as you know, missing people in the United States and Canada would be noticed much sooner, having families and such. They had to be extra crafty to get off scot-free. However, once Project MKUltra officially started in 1953, the CIA set about administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers, who the CIA described as people who could not fight back. Due to their condition or choice of work, they were much easier to rope into experiments. The process of conscripting mentally ill subjects for testing was relatively simple. All it took was a recommendation from their pharmacist or doctor to one of Gottlieb's agents, who were posing as doctors. After being referred to these phony docs, the patients were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements along with other binding documents, and made to stay at the hospital with their crooked new physicians. While under the CIA's care, they could look forward to large doses of LSD and occasional electroshock therapy, and other drugs from time to time depending on the experiment being done. Forced morphine addiction and subsequent withdrawal were relatively common among these. Now, the stick isn't very long here, but the prisoners got the short end of it anyway. Being convicted of crime and kept isolated from the rest of society meant that their torture could be more easily covered up. The experiments performed on them were far more brutal than the ones performed on public candidates. For example, during the early stages of MKUltra, 7 African-American prisoners in Lexington, Kentucky were given triple doses of LSD for 77 consecutive days. As you can imagine, they did not make it out with their minds intact. And the particular experiment they were part of wasn't discovered until the 1970s, nearly 20 years later. Very grisly stuff. On On a slightly lighter note, Gottlieb, in all of his evil brilliance, set up an operation that involved a fully staffed brothel and crates of drugs in San Francisco. This plan involved having targets led into the brothel, who would sometimes even be other CIA agents, and you could probably guess what they were dosed with. No, go ahead. I'll wait. If you chose LSD, congratulations! You've either been paying attention or you've had the video running in the background for so long the word has been subliminally planted in your brain. Which would be pretty on theme now that I think about it. Anyway, the targets would be dosed with LSD by prostitutes, among other drugs depending on the experiments, to see if substances and doing the do would result in some form of mind control. Meanwhile, one of Gottlieb's agents would be privately viewing the entire scene from behind a one-way mirror. These agents were usually provided with pictures of martinis and a portable toilet. Sometimes these things could take a while. My favorite part of this sordid operation was the name it was given. Operation Midnight Climax. Yes, really. You don't have to think about this one too hard. Gottlieb was really having fun with this whole mad science thing. Alright, now back to the dark stuff. Experiments in Canada were largely conducted in the same way that they were in America, but with one stark and very grumpy difference. Gottlieb really couldn't oversee every experiment being done across the globe all at the same time, probably because he was preoccupied with the brothel. When he couldn't attend an operation or a set of experiments, he hired qualified individuals to take on the grisly work for him. This is where Dr. Ewan Cameron comes in. Dr. Cameron was described by his colleagues as domineering, tense, authoritarian, and well-respected. He was so well-respected, in fact, that the Canadian government provided him with grants that he used to fund the MKUltra experiments. He put these funds to work with his patented strategy to quote-unquote blow away the old mind so that a new one could be planted. Before we forget, one of the primary goals of MKUltra was to find a way to force a brainwashed individual to act against their will and forget what they have done shortly after on command, like a remote control hitman. Such a person was usually referred to as a Manchurian candidate in the project's paperwork, defined as a person who is not loyal to or harms their own country or political party because they're under the control or influence of another country or party. Dr. Cameron believed that he was well on the way to creating such an individual with his scientific method. Dr. Cameron set about destroying the old mind with depatterning. In the depatterning segment, the patient would be put into a deep sleep for days using sedatives, during which they were usually hit with massive doses of electroshock therapy, sometimes more than triple the usual recommendation at the time, along with the usual injections of LSD. This long process would usually revert the subject to a childlike state, and some would even have to redo potty training. The doctor then moved on to a technique he called psychic driving. This technique would subject the patient to subliminal messages that would often be repeated hundreds of thousands of times. The messages were relayed to the patient by a helmet with internal speakers, which could not be removed by the patient. During this time, the patient was usually injected with muscular paralytic drugs so that they could better absorb the messages being relayed. Needless to say, Dr. Cameron's work left hundreds of people unable to function in normal society and literally erased family members from existence. In order to seek compensation, the victims and family of members of victims attempted to sue in Canadian legal courts. Now, I say attempted, not because no one won the lawsuit. At least 80 families and victims won publicly. I say attempted because the Canadian government itself put their foot down and began to suppress the victims and their families with NDAs, secretive settlements, and even gag orders. Yes, Canada did its very best to keep their part in MKUltra as hush-hush as possible. And they largely succeeded, as hundreds filed lawsuits and many victims weren't even made aware that compensation was available due to purposefully lackluster marketing. Out of the thousands of victims in Canada, only a few hundred were even made aware of the compensation handouts. And here you thought Canada was all moose, maple, and apologies.
Sorry to break it to you, eh?
Oh, and just in case you were curious, Dr. Cameron lived on after retirement until 1967, where he suffered from a heart attack while mountain climbing with his son and died. As Gottlieb traveled to each experiment, he did so with a group of his closest associates, and one of these associates was a man named Frank Olson. Frank Olson was an American bacteriologist, biological warfare scientist, and chemist who worked under Gottlieb during the MKUltra experiments. As you could assume of a man in his position, he held a great number of secrets under lock and key, not just of MKUltra, but also of other substantial information being hidden from the Soviets, Cold War and all that. He was also privy to a lot of those expendables experiments that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, Olson was not quite as stone cold as Sidney Gottlieb. No, not that stone cold. And Olson felt a great remorse for the crimes against humanity that he had been witness to. He began to have doubts about the MKUltra experiments as a result. So much so that he began to ask other colleagues if they, quote, knew a good reporter. Then around 2 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, November 28, 1953, Olson plummeted all the way from room 1018B onto the sidewalk in front of the Statler Hotel and was pronounced dead at the scene. His family initially stated that he had suffered from a, quote, severe mental breakdown, which resulted in his fall. But it was found later that he had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge 9 days prior to his date with gravity. In the newspapers, the incident was described as the suicide of an army scientist. As it could be inferred, he was not in the army. At the time, he was sharing a room with Harold Abramson, a doctor who is linked to the CIA that Olson had worked with in the past. Rumor even has it that the hotel switchboard operator, you know, the people that used the things like the ones in John Wick to connect calls in the old days, overheard the brief call in which the occupant Harold stated, "Well, he's gone." The recipient said, "That's too bad." The speculation over Frank's death reached such a pitch that in 1994, Eric Olson had his father's remains exhumed to be buried with his mother, but not before a second autopsy was performed with the rest of the family's approval. During the autopsy, a large hematoma, essentially a large bruise, on the left side of Frank's head was discovered, at which point most of the examination team tasked with the autopsy concluded that the trauma to the skull was caused prior to his sudden stop from a high blaze. Only one disagreed, but he was probably paid off. After that, in 2012, his sons Eric and Nils filed a court case in the U.S. District Court of Washington, D.C. Oh, and speaking of pay, the case was dismissed shortly after a settlement was made by the government in 2013. The moral of this story is that you can get away with anything with the right amount of money. Oh, did I mention a movie was made about this? Go check out Wormwood on Netflix if it's still available. Let's take a step back in time once again, back to the late 50s, early 60s. Around this time, the MKUltra project slowly petered out and eventually shut down, much to the relief of anyone watching this video. And what of old man Gottlieb? Arguably the man behind it all. Well, he took on new positions and tasks, like the failed assassination of Fidel Castro.
Can you kill Fidel Castro?
Serious?
After stating that his research was ineffective, and in 1972, he finally retired from the CIA. The logical next step after declaring his retirement was clear. He needed to get rid of the evidence. After Gottlieb was done, 7 full crates of evidence had been destroyed and wiped from the record by his own hands. Gotta admire that work ethic. He then beat off the FBI with the diplomatic immunity that he was given in a secret hearing with a Senate investigator. How convenient. And traveled the world with his wife in his 50s. Despite the time Gottlieb spent in the world of psychedelic drugs and broken safety regulations, he became the ideal citizen. He helped counsel children with stutters, acted in local plays, and was even allowed to work in a hospital in India to treat leprosy patients. Life was going well for the man who ran one of the most unethical scientific programs in the world. That is until Gottlieb received a telegram from the General Counsel of the CIA that ran, "I have bad news for you. Someone has figured out that you exist, and they want to talk to you. Mr. Gottlieb was summoned back to the US by the church committee who were investigating the CIA and discovered Gottlieb's involvement. Yes, in spite of all the evidence he destroyed, some rather talkative pieces remained. During the time of MKUltra, Gottlieb went to the bar. Not for drinks, mind you, but for mad science! He lured a man to a bar and secretly dosed him with LSD to test its effect on people with hepatitis. Thanks to that one chance encounter, the man's social and personal life were essentially ended. He never painted again, never had another relationship, and he became a street person for the rest of his life. The man was eventually able to take the ex-chief chemist and mastermind to court as his sister recognized Gottlieb's clubbed foot from his description on television while he testified to the church committee. But the CIA intervened and delayed the court date so long that the original victim died and his sister had to take over. The CIA was successful with their delays until 1999. The court cases were about to begin and Gottlieb was at risk of having his dirty laundry exposed to the world. At which point he inexplicably died right before his court date. To this day, there is speculation as to how exactly he died, as his wife declined to state the cause of his death. It's still an absolute mystery how the man who made undetectable poisons and toxins for a living died, although his wife did mention his history of heart problems. Guess we'll never know. After hearing all this, you may have one question on your mind. Where did all the drugs go after MKUltra was finished? I will answer that with another question. Remember when I said that the program petered out in the late 60s? Let's play a game. I'm going to display a few images from the 60s and you're going to tell me where the drugs went. Ready? And go! Alright, time's up. Have you guessed it yet? If not, too bad. As the program lost funding, facilities began to shut down and were offered less money to keep proper stock of the contraband. Shortly after, it was found that the LSD actually made subjects question authority even more. The answer simply is that the drugs intended for use in experiments were leaked out to the public. In fact, the sudden surplus of trippy psychedelics was one of the main contributors to the peace and love movement of the 60s, and eventually the war on drugs. I still find it so fascinating that the hippie lifestyle was a direct result of sadistic government overreach and experimentation, as well as other things, I'm sure. And it really goes to show that if life gives you tortured, drugged up lemons, make peace and love. Until next time, my dear viewer,